I'm being real. I used to be a WWE fan back in the day. I used to be heavy on them. I mean, all the kids used to be heavy on it for real. But yeah. You know I fuck with John Cena. That's my nigga, man. But anyway, we got the worst of SmackDown. Cause like we know the best, but what was the worst?
SmackDown has seen a lot of good and bad times over the years. Yes, for every Bloodline angle or SmackDown 6 era, there have been those times when things just haven't worked out. And often this can come in the form of a terrible run for one specific wrestler. But what are the biggest examples of this in SmackDown history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Braun Strowman ruled the roost there as Universal Champion in 2020. Now, to be fair to Braun here, it was hard for this run not to be a flop as it came right at the beginning of everyone's most hated time period in WWE, the Thunderdome era. Yes, with no fans in attendance and everything instead being held in front of a giant Zoom call, it was nigh on impossible for the monster among men to get the people watching at home excited about the product. Sure, you could argue Drew McIntyre managed to do a better job on Raw, but then he's always been great. And let's not forget that it was always in the plans for him to win the WWE title at WrestleMania 36 anyway, so the company already had some stories in mind for him most likely. When it came to Braun, though, he was only put into that Universal title match against Goldberg at the Showcase of the Immortals at the last minute when Roman Reigns pulled out due to health concerns. So it wasn't like Vince McMahon had months worth of angles and opponents already prepared for his new champion. And all that swirled together to create a run we all wish we could forget then. So really, it should come as no surprise that as soon as the Tribal Chief felt comfortable returning to the ring once more, Strowman's time in the main event scene on Friday nights came to a swift end, as he was instead shifted over to Raw, and there slotted into more of a mid-card role. Could it have been better if the circumstances were different? Maybe, if fans were there, as Braun was still pretty over at this point. But even then, it just never felt like the company were behind him as a top guy in any meaningful way.
I'm gonna say Braun Strowman is one of the most annoying people to play on WWE 2K. That's all he's good for.
So it was probably never going to be as good as it could have been. After all, when you're treated like nothing but the placeholder for a bigger star, then it's hard to come across like a big star yourself. And that's something our next subject knows all too well too, because despite being one of the best women's wrestlers in the world, when Toni Storm made it to SmackDown in 2021, she was treated like nothing more than a footnote when compared to opponents like Charlotte Flair. Of course, as we all know now, Toni can be the shining star of a women's division when called upon. You just have to look at her current timeless run on AEW, where she's easily one of the best things about the whole company if you want any evidence of this. Obviously, though, Vince McMahon didn't see any of this in the Australian when he decided to bring her up from NXT in July of that year. No, instead, he just saw her as cannon fodder. Hell, it was worse than that because not only was Toni pretty quickly doing jobs to more focused upon acts like Liv Morgan, but even when she did get a win over the aforementioned Charlotte Flair in order to set up a SmackDown Women's World title match, it would only be via disqualification, proving she wasn't good enough to score a pinfall. And then there's the infamous segment where Toni got pied by the Queen during the lead-up to the match. Perhaps it should come as no surprise then that as a result of her questionable booking, Toni would ask for her release from the company soon thereafter, with this ultimately being granted to her as she from there went on to AEW.
Why she got that dumbass football thing? The dumbass, whatever that eye shade or whatever that is.
And thank God that happened, because if the last thing we had to remember her for was an awful run over on SmackDown, then it would surely have been a stain on her legacy. Probably just as big of a stain as was left on the legacy of one of her former co-workers, Natalya, when she had her terrible farting gimmick in 2012. That's right, it was 2012, and it wasn't the best time for wrestling, but we did have one of the best women's wrestlers in the world on the roster, a bona fide member of the Hart family. So we should at very least be able to use her to put on some good matches and elevate the division a little, right? Well, if you were the booking team for WWE in 2012, then not quite, because that year on the Blue brand, Natalya would not be doing what she did best by putting on good matches. No, instead she'd be farting her way to failure. You heard us right. The Queen of Hearts gimmick at this point was that she passed gas a lot at inopportune times during backstage segments and matches. That's right, this one failed to get over in spectacular fashion. After all, who wanted to see this? We're pretty sure even the kids watching the show thought it was a little too lowbrow for them. That's right, instead of mixing it up with someone like AJ Lee, Natty was more often than not to be found letting one rip and looking embarrassed as comedy performers such as Santino Marella or Hornswoggle walked past her and sold the devastating effects of the stink cloud. That said, for as bad as farting Natalya was, it arguably wasn't as bad as our next failed run on SmackDown, the period we all spent watching Luther Reigns. That's right, before there was the Tribal Chief, there was another Reigns making an attempt to stand at the head of the table on the Blue Brand. But while Roman is a clear megastar and a perfect person to fill such a position, Luther Reigns, well, he wasn't that. No, what you had in this Illinois native was the perfect example of why mid-2000s WWE suffered as much as it did. And that was because he was the embodiment of everything Vince McMahon was trying to turn his roster into then. Big bodybuilder-type performers who didn't have much to offer once the bell rang. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that Luther Reigns failed to get over once he joined the roster in 2000.
The funny thing is, I remember dude just for a minute back in the day. All the way back in the day.
As the personal assistant to then SmackDown general manager Kurt Angle. After all, whenever he was involved in a backstage segment with the Olympic hero, he was outclassed in terms of character work. And whenever he was asked to take to the ring, his limitations there became all too clear almost immediately, which was exactly why his early bouts against the likes of Charlie Haas, The Big Show, and Eddie Guerrero flopped so hard. Even when WWE tried to get him to that next level by having the big man enter into a program with The Undertaker, many fans were uninterested. And when people don't care about an Undertaker feud, there's only one person to blame, and it ain't the dead man. So, perhaps predictably then, once this feud ended and it became clearer than ever that this was one muscular performer who wasn't going to reach the heights of others before him, he started slipping down the pecking order and eventually found himself in a go-nowhere mid-card program with someone we'll get to in a moment. Could things have been different? Maybe, if he'd been given more time in developmental to get better before he was thrust up to live TV, then sure, they might have worked out. But then it's just as possible we simply weren't ready for a Reigns to roll the roost on the Blue Brand quite yet, and so nothing Luther did was going to get him to that level. Either way, the fact remains this is a run which truly has to rank as one of the worst SmackDown has ever seen. And considering some of the bad stuff we've seen there over the years, that's quite impressive. Hell, we still remember the time our next subject briefly became a member of the roster there in 2008. The one, the only, Kizarny.
Mobile games are going big.
Kizarny.
Play the official PC version of Cloud.
Forgotten about Kizarny? Well, let's give you a quick reminder. Basically, this entire gimmick was just an excuse for WWE to tell a joke, and that joke was wrestling started out years ago as something found on the traveling carnival circuit, and so, because of this, a lot of performers today still use carny speak when talking. We're sure you've all heard the term mark, that's carny talk for marking someone with a piece of chalk to signify to people running games that they had money to be lost. How does this all relate to Kizarny then? Well, because his name is nothing more than the carny way of saying carny. And once he stepped in the ring, he could best be described by some as the love child of Jake the Snake Roberts and Doink the Clown, in the sense that he would use psychology to try and get in people's heads, all whilst acting similar to a clown. You can already see why this one didn't work then. And it also didn't help that he would routinely use carnival speak whenever he was cutting promos, with this being something which either confused fans who didn't get the joke, or just made those who did understand it groan. Still, at least it could have mostly been forgiven had Kizarny been able to bring it in the ring, right? Well, yes, but sadly, Nicholas Chekovich, the man behind the character, just wasn't all that great as a wrestler either, and all we saw of him within the squared circle were some pretty basic matches against the likes of Kurt Hawkins, Ryan Braddock, and MVP. So once it became clear the whole thing was flopping soon after this then, WWE felt the best thing to do was to pull the plug and cut the Toronto native from the roster at the beginning of 2009, with him never to be seen on SmackDown again following this. But even if Kizarny was gone,
That's back when I used to watch WWE. I didn't see him then. I never seen
Didn't
him
mean
do.
the dark days of SmackDown were over, because there was still plenty of bad times over the years. And one of the biggest examples of this we ever got happened in 2016 when Eva Marie joined the Blue Brand's roster. Now, we're sure we don't have to tell you that Eva Marie was never exactly the most beloved performer by WWE fans. Sure, she did have the model physique and good looks, which might have seen her become a bigger star in a prior era, but during the mid-2010s, when the focus was starting to become more about treating the ladies like athletes, her lack of in-ring skill didn't cut the mustard for many fans. Of course, this was evident throughout her run on NXT in 2015, just as it was also evident on her brief run on Raw in the spring of 2016. So by the time she was drafted over to SmackDown later that year then, everyone was already well aware of the California native's limitations. Sure, you could argue that Eva Marie was meant to be a heel, and so by playing the role of a performer who only cared about her looks, it was an example of her doing her job properly. And this was proved more by the fact that her whole gimmick during that run was that she never actually set foot in the ring. No, whenever it came time for a match of hers to start, she'd always have some excuse for missing it, whether this be her getting stuck in traffic, or having a wardrobe malfunction, or any number of unfortunate circumstances. Yes, in an era of the four horsewomen rising to the top, and women's wrestling feeling like a legitimate thing in WWE for the first time, the last thing many fans wanted to see was an out-of-date gimmick. And it felt like a relic from the past, and so for this reason, the majority of fans rejected it. So perhaps it's for the best then that come the start of the following year, Eva Marie would have decided to part ways with the company, with her instead moving on to outside endeavors like modeling and podcasting. Of course, it's just a shame that as she was doing this, SmackDown would continue to be dragged down by the continuation of another bad gimmick which had started the year prior. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Hype Bros, of course.
Yeah, we gonna end it right there, man. What the fuck? Nah, but yeah, like and subscribe, man. See y'all on the March Madness games. Peace.